Good to see you this morning. Would you pray with me, please? Help us to find our place, Lord, and to fill it with faithfulness, that you might be praised. Through Christ we pray. Amen. Amen. During those days, another large crowd gathered. Since they had nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to him and he said, I have compassion for these people. They've been with me 3 days already, and they have nothing to eat. If I send them home hungry, they might collapse on the way, for some have come a long distance. His disciples answered, but where, in such a remote place, can we get enough bread to feed them? And Jesus said, how many loaves do you have? 7, they replied. Jesus told the crowd to sit down on the ground. After taking the 7 loaves and giving thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to set before the people. And they did so. They had a few small fish with him as well, and he gave thanks for them also. And he gave them to his disciples to distribute. And the people all ate and were satisfied. Afterwards, the disciples picked up 7 baskets full of broken pieces left over. About 4,000 men were present. After dismissing the crowd, Jesus got into the boat with his disciples and crossed to the region of Dalmanutha. And some Pharisees came and began to question Jesus. To test him, they asked him for a sign from heaven. Jesus sighed deeply and said, why does this generation ask for a miraculous sign? I tell you the truth, no sign will be given to it. Then he got back into the boat and crossed to the other side. The disciples had forgotten to bring any bread with them except for 1 loaf they had with them in the boat. Be careful, Jesus warned them. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. The disciples discussed this with each other and said, it's because we have no bread. Aware of their discussion, Jesus said to them, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still have no faith? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many baskets full of broken pieces did you pick up? They answered, 12. And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many baskets full did I pick up? They answered, 7. And Jesus said to them, do you still not understand? They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. Jesus took him by the hand and led him outside the village. When he had spit on the man's eyes and placed his hands on him, he asked him, do you see anything? And the man looked up and said, I see people. They look like trees walking around. Once again, Jesus placed his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were opened, his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And Jesus sent him home with a warning, don't go into the village. Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. And on the way he asked them, who do people say that I am? And the disciples answered, some say John the Baptist, Others say Elijah. Still others say one of the prophets. But what about you? Jesus asked. Who do you say I am? And Peter answered, you are the Christ. And Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. He spoke to them plainly about this. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. Out of my sight, Satan. You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men. He then called the crowd to him along with his disciples, and he began to teach them, if anyone comes after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it. And whoever loses his life for me and for the gospel will save it. For what would it profit a man if he gained the whole world and forfeit his soul? Or what can a man give in exchange for his soul? I tell you, if anyone is ashamed of me and my word in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of him when he comes in his Father's glory with his holy angels. And he said to them, some who are standing here now will not taste death until they see the kingdom of God come with power. Mark chapter 8 through Mark chapter 9, verse 1. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Amen. So if you remember what I said last week, context makes a difference. And just where Jesus is located in these passages gives us a clue as to the message he's trying to convey. You remember in chapter 4, which we talked about last week, Jesus was altogether in Jewish territory. And all 4 of those parables were basically to a Jewish audience. But now the scene changes. The context is different. We learn in chapter 7, if you go back and look at what just happened before Mark chapter 8, we find out that Jesus is in Gentile territory. He's basically on the east side of the Sea of Galilee in the Decapolis, the area of the 10 cities, which is mostly Gentile territory. And here, Jesus feeds the 4,000. And after he feeds them, he goes back across the lake to the region of Dalmanutha, which is Jewish territory. We don't know where Dalmanutha really is. We haven't located it archaeologically. But we're pretty sure it's Jewish territory because as soon as he lands, the Pharisees come and encounter him. They question him. They test him. They want a sign from heaven. So he's back in Jewish territory, and Jesus tells these Pharisees, these teachers of the law, there's no sign going to be given to you. Not yet, anyway. And then he gets back in the boat and he's crossing to the other side. He goes back to Gentile territory where they eventually end up in Bethsaida, and some people they go back to the north of the Sea of Galilee, which could be both Gentile and Jewish territory, because Bethsaida, we think, is at the north end of the Sea of Galilee, the very north end. And it's kind of that dividing line between Gentile territory and Jewish territory. And he heals a blind man, and we're going to talk about that more in a moment. Remember, it takes 2 attempts to heal his blindness. And Mark is telling us something about discipleship in that miracle. And then from there, Jesus goes into Gentile territory again because he goes north to Caesarea Philippi, which is the most northern region of the Holy Land at that time. It's right at the foot of Mount Hermon. Syria is on the other side. Damascus is not too far away. And that's where Peter confesses him as the Messiah. So context makes a great deal of difference. By the way, Caesarea Philippi, Karen and I have been there several times. It's right at the foot of Mount Hermon, and it's the source of the Jordan River. It's a beautiful place. It's lush, green, gorgeous flowing river that comes through there, rapids. It's also the most pagan place in all of Israel at the time. In fact, there were shrines to pagan gods there, and there was even a prominent temple there created to the newest pagan god, the Roman emperor himself. So it's interesting as to why Jesus takes them clear up to the most pagan place, the most Gentile place, the most secular place, and that's where the disciples at least get some insight into who he really is. So let's look at more of the text. The feeding of the 4,000. So Jesus is in Gentile territory. He's in the region of the Decapolis. They're in a very remote place. The disciples say, where in such a remote place can we get enough bread to feed them? And they're still, we're led to believe, still in confusion about who Jesus is. Even though 2 chapters before this, Jesus had been in Jewish territory and he had fed 5,000 people, and they'd picked up 12 loaves afterwards. You'd think the disciples would have some insight that maybe even in a remote place in Gentile territory, if they have a few loaves of bread, Jesus is going to be able to feed the crowds. But they're not sure about that, even yet. Even after watching Jesus heal blindness, even after watching Jesus drive out demons, even after watching Jesus heal leprosy, even after watching Jesus feed 5,000 people, they're still not sure who this man is. I don't know if you can put yourself in their place, but I have a feeling if we were there with them, we might be as confused as they are, because they're looking and expecting a different kind of leader and Messiah. And they're still not sure that Jesus is the one whom they will acknowledge later on as the Christ. Mark doesn't include for us, like Matthew and Luke does, the Lord, what we call the Lord's Prayer. He does not include that anywhere in his gospel. And yet it's clear that Mark is aware that Jesus provides our daily bread. Remember that phrase in the Lord's Prayer? We say it every Sunday morning, give us this day our daily bread. Well, Mark certainly in these 2 feedings, the 5,000 and the 4,000, Mark is absolutely aware that Jesus is ready and willing to share with us our daily bread. One does not hear Jesus rebuking people for asking for too much of what they really need in Mark's gospel. And Mark is basically setting the scene for us of what's going to happen later on. The scene around Caesarea Philippi. He's unveiling, I think, in these healing stories, these feeding stories. He's unveiling for us, little by little by little, the real mission plan of Jesus. And the failure of the disciples to fully understand what it is Jesus is trying to teach them. Yes?
Errol, I'm beginning to understand a little bit better from what you said why they seemed so hard-headed and couldn't see what was in front of them in Jesus. My question now is, how did the concept of a militant Messiah first arise so it gains, I mean, that was all they thought about. And I understand their persecution, but it goes back so far, and how did that first come up? Did God give them any indication that that he was gonna send a militant Messiah to free them?
Yeah, great question. I wish we had a biblical scholar here. But here's what I think.
Yeah.
King David.
Yeah.
He is the quintessential king of Israel. And David is not only this person who can write beautiful psalms and play instruments of music and dance before the Lord. He's not only, in a sense, a deeply spiritual person, but he's a military leader, yes? And I think they had in their mind that when the Messiah comes, he would be someone like David. After all, God says, David is a man after my own heart. So they're going to expect some kind of military / priest type leader, I think. Now, did God give them any hint that the Messiah would be something different? Well, we Christians look back at passages in Isaiah, and we read into those passages that he's going to be a suffering servant.
Yeah.
He's going to be rejected by men. So, yes, that's the way I would answer it. Now, if we had a real scholar here,
Yeah.
they might add to that.
That's helpful, thank you.
Yes, sir.
I'm trying, but I can't picture in my mind where all these loaves of bread came from. Can you picture that, or do you ever try to picture that? I mean, it's a humbling, very humbling thing to not be able to understand that.
Well, I'm with you. I resemble that remark. It's a humbling thing. Yes, do you have an answer to this?
Yes, I do.
Oh, thank you.
I have heard and read many times that scene interpreted as a miracle of generosity.
Yeah,
And people have
that.
theorized that some of the people brought food, some had none. And so under Jesus' inspiration, they shared. And as they passed along, more and more food got there so that there was food left over. And I liked that because I too had really trouble picturing loaves multiplying out of thin air. So I've always accepted that interpretation.
I'll tell you what I think.
I wish you would.
There's a famous country singer by the name of Iris DeMent. I don't know if you know her or not. If you live in Bristol, Tennessee for 30 years the way we do, you're going to get bluegrass music in your pores. And Iris DeMent has a wonderful song called Let the Mystery Be. And there's some things about these miracles. I mean, I personally can't just dismiss the miracles.
Right.
And in some sense, I want to say, let the mystery be. There's some mystery to this. And whether it was a miracle of generosity or a miracle of multiplying the loaves physically, I just don't know. I can't get my head around that because I've not seen something like that. But if Jesus is who Mark says he is, he's certainly capable of that.
Sure.
He's certainly capable of doing something in our experience that we say, wow, how could that possibly be? And I'm kind of with Iris DeMent. She says, you know, we all want to know where we came from, and we all want to know where we're going when this whole thing's done, but I'm just going to let the mystery be. And I think that's part of where we are with the miracles. I don't want to be like Thomas Jefferson, who's going to rip out every miracle in the Bible, and you end up with just a few pages of kind of history. And yet, I don't know how to explain these things. Yes, sir.
Yeah, in our own mind, we don't questioned the manna from heaven during the Jewish migration to the Sinai.
Yeah, manna from heaven, sure. And, you know, the healing of the blind man,
He could heal a blind
the
man.
driving out of demons, these are all things that God can do, I can't do. Yes, sir.
Suppose Einstein had let the mystery be. I mean, where would we be, you know?
Well, you know,
Huh?
Einstein was right about a lot of things, but wrong about one of the biggest things. And he in a sense regretted that he thought the universe was static.
What's what?
Static rather than dynamic. And I don't know, there's some mystery even to physics, right? There's some mystery even to mathematics. I know I'm not a mathematician or a physicist. If I could live another life, I'd like to be either a theoretical physicist or a cello player. Like Pablo Casals. You know, I don't know which I do, although there's a connection between science and music, I think. But I don't know where I'm going with this. But you know, oh yeah, some mathematicians will tell you, we don't know if this theory is true. We don't know if this formula is true. We haven't advanced far enough to where we can actually demonstrate it. But it's so beautiful, it must be true. Or it's so beautiful. They use this language. It's so beautiful that we're going to trust it enough to send a rocket into space. We don't know if the physics works out there at the far reaches of the universe like they work here on Earth, but it's so, our formulas are so beautiful, we're going to take a risk with it. We're willing to do that. And I think faith's a little bit like that. There are mysteries involved. If we get rid of all the mysteries, we're going to get rid of most of the power. That's my feeling about that. Yes.
I'd like to add some thoughts that complement some of these comments. I don't resent Albert Einstein for not seeing string theory.
Right.
Isaac Newton didn't either. And we don't belittle
Yeah,
Isaac
he didn't
Newton.
see E equals MC squared, did he?
Oh, right. So it doesn't diminish Einstein to me that he didn't see yet another fifth or sixth step beyond the redshift or
Right.
string theory. When it comes to miracles, I've heard people in this building talk about miracles they didn't believe in. And what I don't do to them is challenge them, but tell me about the miracles you do believe in. And when I think if they were to stop and describe the miracles they do believe in, that they might have trouble then quibbling over why this miracle maybe wasn't real, but that miracle was. Because healing Lazarus was enough for me, you know, and
Yeah.
the 42 other healings in front of 700 people mean a lot to me, and then so the bread thing is an easy step for me to take.
Yeah, and I think if we can explain a miracle scientifically, I think we ought to go ahead and do so. I mean, we're invited to do so. After all, God has said, you've got a brain, and I invite you to find as much truth as you possibly can with all the resources of this great instrument of our mind and intellect that we possibly can. But I still think we come back ultimately to the idea of iris dement. You know, let some of the mystery be. That if we get rid of all the mystery, if we say there's no mystery to this, just deny the idea that there's something beyond us, we're basically denying some of the very foundations of what we say we believe when we recite the Apostles' Creed, etc. So I'm not against science. I'm all for science. I think science and faith go together, absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, was it Justin Martyr who says, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? Well, it has a great deal to do with Jerusalem. Athens and Jerusalem go together. Faith and science go together. Okay, so where are we? Basically Mark getting us ready, I think. Remember I said we start out in chapter 1, and Mark tells us in the very first sentence, the beginning of the gospel about Jesus Christ, the Son of God. In that first sentence, his topical sentence, he's giving us his plan for the whole book of Mark. I'm going to tell you about Jesus. I'm going to tell you about the Messiah. I'm going to tell you about the Son of God in a very special sense. And so these first 7 chapters are really telling us a lot about Jesus. And he's trying to get us ready for that moment up there in Caesarea Philippi, in a very northern place, the most secular place. He's getting us ready for Peter's confession that says, "You're the Christ." But still, did you catch it? Peter knows, but he doesn't know. He knows, but he doesn't know. He sees, but he doesn't see. He hears, but he doesn't hear. I resemble Peter a lot. You know, I see, but I don't see. I hear, but I don't hear. I understand, and yet I don't understand. It's part of what we're talking about the mystery of it all. And so Mark is getting us ready with all these healings and feedings and things like that, and he's getting ready for us, for the scales to drop from our eyes, and we finally get a little bit of insight. Up there in Bethsaida, a blind man receives his sight, but it takes Jesus 2 times to touch him before he sees everything clearly. Yes? And it's kind of like the disciples. They've had all of these experiences with Jesus, and little by little they're beginning to understand more and more and more and more, but they still are seeing people, they look like trees walking around. They're seeing Jesus, but he doesn't look like what they really expect him to be. And then finally Peter gets this little bit of insight, and he says, "Oh, you're the Messiah, you're the Christ." And then Jesus starts telling them what the Messiah is really like. That is, he's going to suffer and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and teachers of the law, and that he's going to be killed and after 3 days rise from the dead. And Peter, can you imagine this? Peter takes him aside and he rebukes him. "Lord, wait a minute, that's not how I see the Messiah here. You know, let me tell you who you are." And Jesus, have you ever had that experience with Jesus? And I'm saying, "Jesus, you got it all wrong here. This is what's supposed to be happening in my life." And Jesus then rebukes Peter and he says, "Out of my sight, Satan, you do not have in mind the things of God." God has in mind a different kind of Messiah, a different anointed one. And then he calls the crowd and he begins to teach them. "If anyone comes after me," this is tough stuff. Christianity is not for sissies. I mean, I don't know if we can hear this in our culture. It's really hard to hear this because we've been so acculturated into our system, our way of thinking about following Jesus. But he says, "If anyone comes after me, he must deny himself." That's not going to go over with my students, I tell you that. It's all about me. He must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever, listen to this, whoever would save his life will lose it. And whoever loses his life for me and the gospel's sake will find it. Wow. That's really tough stuff. Yes, sir.
Can you recite again, Errol, what Peter actually said to Jesus?
He said, "You are the Christ."
No, when he rebuked him.
Oh,
When he took him aside.
What did he say? Mark doesn't tell us what he said. It says Peter took him aside and then began to rebuke him.
Okay, not any detail.
No details. I'm just making up
Does it-
stuff.
Well,
It was a private conversation.
the reason I ask is
I'm not
because-
letting the mystery be.
Well, the reason I ask is because I interpret it differently. I interpret the conversation a little bit differently.
Okay.
Is that Peter told Jesus, "You can't say that because people aren't gonna believe it, it's gonna get you in
Ah.
trouble.
Ah,
This isn't gonna sell.
uh-huh. That's
Be
possible
careful.
too.
Be careful, because this is tough, because he's closer to the people and is probably worried about where this is headed. More in the nature of a consultant. I mean, he's his right-hand man, and he's trying to tell him.
Sort of like a lawyer?
Or a political consultant.